Imagine someone proudly saying, "I'm 100% British." Now imagine telling them this. Your earliest ancestors on this island had dark skin, blue eyes, spoke a language no one on Earth understands today, and if they saw you with your tea and your flag, they'd have no idea you were one of them. From a DNA point of view, the British is not an ancient, pure tribe. It's more like a layered cake that's been baked, sliced, smashed, rebuilt, soaked, and re-iced so many times that the original recipe is almost gone. Let's start at the bottom layer. The island that wasn't an island. 12,000 years ago, there is no Britain. The northwest of Europe is one continuous landmass. Where you see the North Sea on a map today, there's low, boggy ground, rivers, lakes, forests. Archaeologists call part of it Doggerland. People hunt deer and wild cattle across it. They fish brackish estuaries where now only trawlers pass. When the last ice age loosens its grip, the world warms. Glaciers retreat north, the sea rises, and slowly that low land begins to drown. But before it does, small bands of hunter-gatherers follow the retreating ice and the migrating animals north and west onto a peninsula of higher ground. That peninsula will eventually become an island. Later still, it will be called Britain. They never know that. To them, it's just here. Genetically, these people belong to a wide family of Western European hunter-gatherers. When scientists read fragments of their DNA from ancient bones, a strange picture appears. Many of them likely had dark or very dark skin and dark curly hair, combined with light eyes, blue or green. They are not Vikings, they are not Celts, those words don't exist yet. They're simply humans living at the edge of a cold sea, following herds and seasons. Their world is small but intense. Firelight thrown against cave walls. Simple huts of wood and hide near rivers. Children taught to read tracts, not books. Myths carried only in memory, never on paper. They bury their dead, sometimes carefully, sometimes not. They leave flint tools, butchered bones, ochre stains, and, by accident, microscopic pieces of themselves, DNA locked inside teeth and the dense bone of the inner ear. Thousands of years later, we drill into that bone, sequence the DNA, and compare it to living people on the island. Here comes the first shock. Modern Britons carry only a faint whisper of these first islanders. The people who walked Britain when it was still half attached to Europe, who watched the sea rise and swallow their hunting grounds, are not the main ancestors of today's population. Their line almost disappears. Something or someone comes after them. Strangers with wheat. Around 4000 BC, the coastline of Britain looks more familiar. The seas have done their work. Doggerland is gone. Britain is finally an island. On its shores lie scattered communities of hunter-gatherers, descendants of those first dark-skinned, light-eyed nomads. They know every bend of certain rivers, every good fishing spot, every seasonal track the deer take. They have no idea their time is nearly over. Across the water, to the south and east, a much bigger story has been unfolding. Thousands of years earlier, in the hills and plains of what is now Turkey and the Near East, people learned an entirely new way to live: farming. Instead of chasing animals, they penned them. Instead of gathering wild grains, they planted them. Villages appeared, then larger villages, then something like towns. The descendants of those early farmers moved slowly west, generation after generation. They carried with them not just sheep, goats, cattle, and wheat, but a completely different relationship with land and time. Land was no longer just where the herd is this season. It became inheritance, borders, ownership, graves. Eventually, some of them reached the Atlantic coast. They learned to work with boats, to cross short stretches of sea, and one day, someone looked northwest at the cool green outline of an island. To them, Britain was not mystical Albion, it was unused land. When these farming people arrive, they bring polished stone axes, sharp enough to cut down forest, pottery to store grain, and seeds that will rewrite the landscape. They clear trees and plant fields. They build permanent houses, they construct long barrows, elongated tombs of earth and stone where generations of the same family might be buried under one roof of soil. To the existing hunter-gatherers, they must have seemed like aliens. They don't move with the seasons, they anchor themselves. They invest enormous effort in the dead, building tombs visible for miles. They treat animals not as fleeting prey, but as walking wealth. And beneath all that, they are genetically different. When we sequence the DNA of Neolithic skeletons from Britain, the farmers who built the first big monuments, who raised the early versions of places like Stonehenge, we find that most of their ancestry traces back to those early Anatolian farmers, mixed with a little bit of local hunter blood. The old Mesolithic genome is still there, but fading, like a face at the far end of a long corridor. Within a relatively short time, the genetic balance on the island flips. The hunter-gatherer ancestry shrinks. Farmer ancestry dominates. If you are British today, you likely carry more DNA from these immigrant farmers than from the first people who saw Britain at all. They didn't just change the genes, they changed the culture. From their worldview comes the idea of fields instead of endless forest, of harvest instead of luck, of boundaries instead of wandering. Their religious life seems tied to cycles of sun and moon, growth and decay. They align their monuments to solstices and equinoxes, to the rising and setting of heavenly bodies. Walk through the mist of Salisbury Plain at dawn and see those great stones catching first light. You're looking at the theology of farmers, written in rock. For a while, this agricultural Britain feels stable, the same way a person who has just finished rebuilding a house feels. Now it's done. Now it will stay like this. It doesn't. The people of the Beakers. Around 2500 BC, a different kind of grave begins to appear across Europe. Instead of long communal tombs, there are single graves under small mounds. Instead of placing many people together over time, one body is laid down, often with a selection of personal objects: a copper dagger, a stone archer's wrist guard, a finely made drinking vessel shaped like an upside-down bell. These pottery cups will give the culture its modern name, the Beaker people. For a long time, scholars argued about them. Were they an invasive people sweeping across the map, or just a fashion, a Beaker style that different groups adopted? Ancient DNA gave its verdict, and for Britain, it was brutal. In grave after grave from this period, the genetic profile changes dramatically. The people buried with beaker pots, metal weapons, and new ornaments are not simply local farmers with trendy cups. They are largely new people, carrying a big chunk of ancestry that ultimately traces back to pastoralist herders from the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea. When we compare genomes before and after the Beaker horizon, it looks as if up to 9 out of 10 genetic lineages on the island are replaced within a few hundred years. Imagine that. In a time span shorter than the gap between the Normans and us, the descendants of the first Anatolian farmers of Britain are mostly gone, replaced by a population whose roots wind back through continental Europe to the open steppe. We don't know exactly how it felt. Did the newcomers arrive with plague that devastated the locals? Did they come in bands that slowly took over land, marrying local women and pushing other men aside? Was it violent conquest, slow assimilation, or both? Whatever the human details, your DNA sees only the result. The Bronze Age population of Britain, the people who cast metal tools and weapons, who buried their dead with personal status symbols, who probably spoke an early ancestor of Celtic languages, is overwhelmingly descended from these Beaker-linked migrants. Their genetic signature is still strong in many people in Britain and Ireland today. So, roll the tape back again. The dark, blue-eyed hunter-gatherers, mostly gone from modern genomes, traces only. The early farmers who chopped down ancient wildwoods and raised the first great stone circles largely replaced their monuments inherited by strangers. The Beaker people, with their metal blades and steppe ancestry, they become a huge part of the base layer of British DNA. And all of this happens before there is a single Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, or Norman on the island. When you say, "my British ancestors," which ones do you mean? The ones who walked on land now under the North Sea? The ones who hauled stones for monuments they didn't live to see finished? Or the ones who arrived later with new genes, new gods, new ways to fight? We haven't even reached written history yet, and already Britain has been remade, genetically, more than once. In the next part, we step into the era where names and chronicles finally catch up with the DNA and watch the island get invaded, settled, and reshuffled again by Romans, Saxons, Vikings and Normans, all leaving their own fingerprints in the genome. By the time we reach written history, Britain has already been genetically rebooted twice. But now the island is about to become visible to itself and to everyone else. The next chapters give you the pieces most people name when they talk about British blood. Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, Normans. What almost nobody realizes is how differently each of these waves touched the DNA of the islands. Some arrive like a tide and soak deep into the gene pool. Some arrive like a thin layer of gold leaf. Bright, powerful, but only on the surface. Let's walk it through. An empire in miniature on a rainy island. When Roman soldiers first see the cliffs of Britain, it's not a blank slate. The island is full of people we would call Celtic, warrior aristocrats, hill forts, tribes with names like Iceni and Trinovantes, a patchwork of kingdoms and rival chiefs. Their languages are cousins of what will later be spoken in Wales, Ireland, and Brittany. Their gods live in groves and rivers as much as on hilltops. Their warriors fight naked or in bright cloaks, heavy torques on their necks, hair limed and spiked. Genetically, these Iron Age Britons are the heirs of that Beaker plus farmer mix from part 1. Their DNA is already British looking in a way a modern geneticist would recognize. Then Rome arrives, not all at once, not everywhere, and not equally. But where it sticks, it changes everything. Roman Britain is not just Italians in armor. It's a micro-empire. On a rainy island at the edge of the known world, you could, in a single day, meet a local Briton serving as an auxiliary soldier on Hadrian's Wall, a merchant from Gaul haggling over wine prices in Londinium, a Syrian archer staring at the fog and wondering what gods rule this place, an African cavalryman born near the Sahara, now patrolling cold marshes. The empire moves people around like pieces on a board. Troops, officials, merchants, slaves, they all carry their genes with them. In the busy towns and forts, they mix. If your ancestry today has a faint hint from the Mediterranean, from the Middle East, from North Africa, there is a small chance some of it slipped in here. One soldier who never went home, one marriage between a local woman and an officer who liked the climate more than he expected. But here's the key point. Rome in Britain is thin. The empire overlays its own grid roads, forts, cities, tax stations onto a mostly rural Celtic island. The vast majority of people are local farmers who might pay taxes in Roman coins, worship a blend of old and new gods, maybe pick up a little Latin, but genetically, they remain very similar to their pre-Roman cousins. When Rome withdraws its legions in the early 5th century, the urban grid doesn't last long. Towns shrink or collapse, villas rot, the empire's paperwork evaporates. The genetics barely notices. Underneath the rubble, the same island DNA is still there. The truly big shakeup comes from somewhere else. The angle problem. When British becomes English, stand on an east coast beach of Britain in the 5th or 6th century, look across the gray water. On the other side, along what is now northern Germany, the Netherlands and southern Denmark are flat lands of fields and sea marshes. There, small Germanic-speaking groups, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and their neighbors fish, farm, raid, and watch the Roman world fall apart. As imperial control crumbles, the richest thing left in Northwest Europe is land, and Britain has a lot of it. What happens next is messy, and our written sources are biased. Later English chronicles tell a simple story, invited mercenaries who then took over. Archaeology and genetics show something more complicated and, in some regions, more brutal. From the 400 seconds onward, ship after ship crosses the North Sea. Some carry hired warriors, others carry whole families, cattle, tools, seeds. They settle first along the east and southeast coasts, then push inland. You can think of it like this. In some places, local British elites make deals with incoming warbands. Fight for us, marry into us, and you can have a slice of power. In other places, the newcomers may simply seize land in waves of violence we'll never see written down. Over a few centuries in much of what is now England, 3 things happen at once. Language shift. The old Celtic tongues fade. A new Germanic language takes root. That language, heavily changed over time, will become English. Cultural shift. Hill forts and roundhouses give way to timber halls and villages oriented around a lord's mead hall, where loyalty is sworn and poems are sung about fate and fame. Genetic shift. In many regions, especially in eastern and southern England, a big chunk of the gene pool is replaced or heavily diluted by migrants from across the North Sea. Ancient DNA from early medieval graves shows that in some communities in eastern England, the majority of ancestry looks continental, like people from modern northern Germany and Denmark. In others, local British and incoming Saxon lines mix. The island doesn't become German, it becomes something new, Anglo-Saxon England. What does daily life look like now? Villages of wooden houses clustered along streams, fields divided into strips, people tied by loyalty to a local lord more than to any distant king. Pagan gods with names like Woden and Thunor honored at groves and polls, slowly giving way to Christianity brought back via Rome and Ireland. A warrior might be buried with his sword, shield, and spear, a pattern of earthy status that echoes across grave fields. A woman might be buried with brooches, beads, keys, signs of her household's wealth. When you hear modern English, you're hearing the descendant of the language these migrants brought. Everyday words, house, bread, child, water, earth, strong, swear, love, hate, are all Germanic at their core. Genetically, if you have deep roots in eastern or southern England, there's a good chance a substantial part of your DNA comes from these people. But the island is not uniform. The further west and north you go, the stronger the older layers remain. In Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, and Ireland, Celtic languages survive. Populations there show more continuity with pre-Saxon, Iron Age ancestry. The DNA map of the modern UK still carries this east-west contrast. More continental Germanic signal in the east, more older British-Irish signal in the western and northern fringes. By the 8th century, a foreigner looking at the map would see a patchwork of English kingdoms in the east and south, Celtic-speaking realms in the west and north, occasional monasteries linking everything in a web of religion and writing. And then, once again, strangers appear on the horizon. The Vikings. Names in the map, traces in the blood. In a sense, the Vikings are cousins of the Anglo-Saxons. Their homelands curve further north, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and their languages are close enough that early on, they can sometimes understand each other. What they bring that's new is not their genes alone, but the scale and style of their movement. At first, they come to raid. Fast boats, surprise attacks on wealthy monasteries. The island's chroniclers call them heathen men, pagans, wolves. To a monk in a wooden church by the sea, a fleet of long ships silhouetted against a stormy horizon must have looked like the end of the world. But raids are only the beginning. Soon, Viking groups start overwintering. Then, they start settling. In the north and east of what is now England, large swaths of land fall under what later will be called the Danelaw areas, where Scandinavian law and custom dominate. Towns like York become major Viking power centers, plugged into trade networks that stretch to the Arctic North, the Russian rivers, even the Middle East. What does this mean for DNA? In places with heavy settlement, parts of Yorkshire, the East Midlands, Orkney, the Western Isles, parts of Ireland, and the Isle of Man, you see a measurable Scandinavian genetic signal. It's not overwhelming in most of England, but it's there, a visible ripple. You also see Viking fingerprints in the map itself. Place names ending in by farm or village, like Grimsby, Whitby. Names ending in Thorpe, Thwaite, Scale. Personal names in records that are unmistakably Norse. Gunnar, Thorstein, Sigrid. Life in these mixed regions would have felt like an odd cultural soup. Anglo-Saxon farmers under a Danish overlord. Local women marrying Norse settlers. Children growing up speaking a blend of languages that will quietly reshape English grammar and vocabulary. If you use words like sky, window, egg, skirt, husband, law, you're already speaking with a Viking echo. Their short, Punchy words slip deep into English because generations of bilingual kids grew up needing them. Genetically, if you have roots in certain northern or eastern regions, you might carry slightly higher levels of Scandinavian-like ancestry. But the Vikings don't replace everyone. They join the existing mix, another layer on the cake. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the lines between Anglo-Saxon and Viking are already blurring. Rulers like Canute control both England and parts of Scandinavia, elites intermarry, cultures fuse, and then, just when the island might have settled into a new equilibrium, a final major wave of conquerors lands. The Normans? Small numbers, big shadow. In 1066, a duke from across the channel claims the English throne and lands with an army. His name is William. History will call him the Conqueror. The men riding with him are Normans, originally descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France a couple of centuries earlier, adopted the French language, and fused with the local Frankish and Gallo-Roman population. So what are they? Genetically, a mix. Northern French with a spice of Scandinavian from those earlier raiders. When they cross the channel, they're not a vast migrating people with families and herds, they're a relatively small war elite. Yet their impact on British history is enormous. They win the crucial battles. They seize the top of the social pyramid. They build castles of stone, stamp their legal system, and install their own men as lords over land worked by English peasants. From a DNA perspective, the Norman conquest is like pouring a thin but potent syrup over the cake. The average peasant's ancestry doesn't change overnight. But the elite male lines at the top of society now often trace back to Normandy and northern France. Over time, some of that elite DNA filters down through intermarriage and illegitimate children. If you have an English surname that can be traced back to Norman lords, somewhere in your tree you might have a Norman male line. But for most people on the island, the underlying genetic base continues to be that older mix. Beaker plus Celtic plus Anglo-Saxon plus bits of Viking. Culturally, though, the Normans are like an operating system update. The language of power becomes a French-Latin blend. For centuries, law, government, and high culture are conducted in tongues most peasants don't fully understand. English doesn't die, it goes underground, into fields, workshops, kitchens, farm tracks, taverns. There it absorbs new words from above, legal terms, courtly phrases, refined descriptions of food and fashion. That's why modern English often has two words for the same thing. A Germanic one, cow, pig, used by the people who raised the animals. A French-derived one, beef, pork, mutton, used by the people who ate them at the high table. Your everyday speech is built from this class struggle in vocabulary. Norman barons also remake the landscape with stone, castles, cathedrals, great halls. They import new ideas of feudal obligation, new forms of chivalry and knighthood, new ways of writing history, often to justify their own rule. Yet underneath, the majority of people keep farming, marrying, burying their dead in parish churchyards, passing on the same mixed DNA. By the late Middle Ages, if you took a nationwide genetic snapshot, you would see something like this. In England, especially the East and South, a strong base of Anglo-Saxon, continental Germanic ancestry, plus older British, plus a scattering of Scandinavian and Norman, French threads. In Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Cornwall, more continuity with older Celtic-speaking populations, less of the Germanic signal, though certainly not zero. In pockets of the country, hints of other arrivals, Jewish communities, merchants from Italy and the Low Countries, a few Africans and others who came through trade and the sea. The idea that there was ever a single, pure British stock is already long dead by this point. The island is a biological palimpsest. Words, laws, customs, and genes, written, erased, partially overwritten, written again. And that's before the biggest demographic earthquakes of all. The rise of the British Empire, the internal migrations of the Industrial Revolution, the arrival of people from the Caribbean, South Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, and beyond in the last few centuries. Those waves are so recent that they sit almost on the surface of modern DNA reports, and there were many real living Britons today suddenly see their family story twist in unexpected directions. In the final part, we'll jump forward into that modern world. What does a British DNA test really show today? Why is a person from Cornwall genetically closer to someone in Brittany than to a person in Newcastle? How do tea, pubs, football, and stiff upper lip fit into a story written by migrants, conquerors, and survivors? And what does it mean in a country built on so many layers to say, this is who we are? If you open a DNA app in London today and it tells you British and Irish 82%, it sounds simple. British, Irish, job done. But if you could peel back that neat blue block on the screen, you'd see what you now know is hiding underneath. Hunter-gatherers drowned by the North Sea, farmers from the Eastern Mediterranean, steppe riders in Beaker cups, Iron Age Celts, Roman soldiers from 3 continents, Anglo-Saxon settlers, Viking traders, Norman barons. The modern British genome is not a flag, it's a stack. And the last few layers of that stack were laid down very fast. The island that went global. For most of its early history, Britain is the place people come to. Then, in the age of sail and gunpowder, the direction flips. Ships leave Portsmouth, Liverpool, Bristol, London, and keep going. To the Americas, to India, to Africa, to Australasia, to islands nobody in Europe had ever named in their own language before. Sugar, tea, cotton, tobacco, spices, opium, timber, people, everything that can be moved is moved. Wealth flows back into Britain. So do lives. Sailors from West Africa and the Caribbean walking the docks of London and Liverpool, Indian ayahs pushing prams in British parks, Chinese seamen marooned by shipping lines that go bust, students, servants, performers, political exiles. For a long time, their numbers are relatively small. They leave traces in parish records, old photos, the odd astonished diary entry, a black trumpeter at the Tudor court, a Punjabi lascar in a northern pub, a Chinese boarding house near the docks. Some of them marry locals, some have children. Small amounts of non-European DNA slip quietly into the island's gene pool centuries before anyone has an app to notice. But the big change comes after empire reaches its peak and then cracks. The industrial mixer. While the empire sends ships outward, something else happens inside the island. The Industrial Revolution. Coal, iron, steam, mills, mines, railways, smoky towns blooming in valleys. For DNA, industrialization is like taking all the regional strands of Britain and dumping them into a giant blender. Previously, a person born in a Cornish village might marry someone from the next parish, maybe the one after that. A Highlander might marry another Highlander. A Yorkshire farmer stayed Yorkshire. Now, young people from Welsh valleys move to English industrial cities. Highlanders head south to Glasgow or beyond. Irish emigrants fleeing famine pour into Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, London. Rural English families send sons and daughters to work in factories hundreds of miles away. In your DNA today, that shows up as a subtle fuzzing of boundaries. But the old patterns don't vanish completely. When geneticists sample people whose grandparents all come from the same small area, they still see distinct clusters. People in Cornwall often cluster closer to people in Brittany than to people in Newcastle, a leftover echo of a time when the far west of Britain and the northwest of France were one Celtic-facing Atlantic world. People in Wales carry more of that older island ancestry and less of the later Anglo-Saxon layer than people in Eastern England. People in Orkney show a stronger Scandinavian flavor than most of mainland Scotland, a memory of Viking jarls ruling sea roads rather than land borders. On a DNA map of the UK, the country doesn't look like one smooth blue block. It looks like a patchwork quilt, sewn from pieces that remember which side of which mountain your great-grandparents lived on. And then, in the mid-20th century, another wave of movement hits, this time, again, from outside. Windrush, curry houses, and Eastern Europe. After the Second World War, Britain is damaged, exhausted, and short of workers. The government invites people from across what's left of the empire to come help rebuild the mother country. Many do. Ships like the Empire Windrush bring Caribbean migrants to London. Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis follow, along with people from East and West Africa, Cyprus, Hong Kong. Later, after the fall of the Soviet bloc and the expansion of the EU, Poles, Romanians, Lithuanians, and others joined the flow. Now, if you stand in a London street and take DNA samples from 100 random people, the phrase British ancestry could mean almost anything. A Sikh whose grandparents came from Punjab, a Jamaican British man whose ancestors were kidnapped from West Africa centuries earlier, a white Londoner whose Irish great-grandparents arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a name, a Polish nurse who moved here in 2006 and is raising kids who sound more London than she ever will, a mixed heritage kid whose DNA is a mosaic of Jamaica plus Ireland plus India plus Yorkshire. There is no single British genome anymore, if there ever was. There are British ways of living and millions of different genomes wearing them. So when a DNA test labels a color on your pie chart British and Irish, it is not saying you are made of this one ancient thing. It's saying some of your DNA looks like the pre-industrial people who lived on these rainy islands before the last big waves of global migration. Everything layered on top of that Caribbean, South Asian, African, Middle Eastern, East Asian, European, mainland is also part of British DNA now, in the only sense that matters. People carrying it live here, love here, argue here, vote here, die here. The genes don't ask for passports. So who are the British? Really? If DNA alone can't define British, what does? This is where history melts into culture. Think of the things people joke about when they talk about the British. Tea as a medical treatment for everything from heartbreak to house fires. The quiet murder of emotion under a phrase like, "I'm not too bad." Apologizing when someone bumps into you. Cues treated like sacred architecture. Obsessing over weather that rarely does anything truly dramatic. Football as weekly religion. Pub as informal temple. Weekends sliced between DIY supermarket runs and some odd, very specific hobby. None of these came from one tribe, one era, one DNA source. They're habits that grew in the cracks between all the layers. The love of tea? Tea is Chinese, sugar is Caribbean. The corporate muscle behind it was imperial and often violent. But the ritual of put the kettle on when anything happens is something the island turned it into all by itself. The stiff upper lip, that famous emotional control, part Victorian morality, part wartime necessity, part older warrior shame about showing fear. A Celt facing a Roman, a Saxon facing a Viking, a Londoner and the Blitz, all of them had reasons to swallow their panic and carry on. The pub? Take the Roman tavern, the medieval alehouse, the coaching inn on the road, the industrial working man's club, seasoned with cheap beer and televised sport, and you get the modern British pub. A social gene that replicates everywhere from tiny villages to city estates. Sunday roast, Christmas crackers, village feats, school uniforms, sarcastic humor, self-deprecation so sharp it's basically self-harm, the monarchy as a kind of living museum piece. None of this belongs to one bloodline. It's what happens when dozens of bloodlines try to live together on a damp rock for long enough that they start inventing little shared rituals to make the damp feel like home. Your DNA carries the hardware, how your liver handles alcohol, whether your ancestors adapted to cow's milk, how easily you sunburn, which diseases scared your immune system most. Your culture is the software. How you drink, when you drink, what you call the drink, what jokes you tell after, and whether you apologize to the table when you spill it. Britishness lives in that software layer. Reading your British DNA without lying to yourself. So if you take a DNA test and it says 60% British and Irish, 20% French and German, 10% Scandinavian, 10%. Other, what can you truthfully say? You can't say, I am 60% Celt, 20% Norman, 10% Viking. The categories don't line up that neatly. What you can say is something like, most of my ancestry looks like people who were living somewhere in the British Isles before the last few centuries of global migration. Some of my DNA looks more like mainland Northwest Europeans, some like Scandinavians, which fits with the layers of Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Normans that history talks about. That's it. The rest is storytelling. And there is nothing wrong with storytelling as long as you remember you're the storyteller. If you feel a tug when you read about Celts on misty hills, or Viking ships in the dawn light, or Roman legions marking out straight roads across swamps, that's fine. Let it inspire you. Let it give you goosebumps. Just don't confuse the feeling you like with a scientific label that proves you belong more than someone else. Because here's the last twist. The same DNA that makes a person look British in the eyes of an app also appears in slightly different proportions in people across half of Europe. The British genetic signature is not a sealed treasure chest. It's a regional flavor of a very large continental stew. When you stand on a cliff in Cornwall staring at the Atlantic, your genes rhyme with people in Brittany, in Galicia, in parts of Ireland. When a Scot walks in the hills, part of their DNA echoes with people in Scandinavia. An English farmer in East Anglia might be genetically closer to someone in the Netherlands than to a person in West Wales. Borders are political, genes are geographical and historical. The real hook, you are a story, not a percentage. So, what does all this mean for you? The person sitting here, maybe with a mug of tea, maybe with a printout of your DNA results open in another tab. It means this. When you say I'm British, you are pointing at a story, not a statistic. A story where the land itself was once part of the continent, then torn away by water. Dark-skinned, pale-eyed hunters followed deer across plains now under the sea. Farmers from the east turned forest into field and raised stones that still stand. Horse-loving newcomers remade the gene pool and birthed Celtic Britain. Rome briefly covered the island with a thin film of empire. Germanic warriors and families crossed the gray water and took root as English. Norse sailors carved their names into the map and the language. French-speaking Normans rewired power from the top down. The island went out into the world, built an empire, and then watched the world walk back in. And after all of that, a child was born. Your DNA is the receipt of every ship that ever landed, every army that ever crossed a river, every couple that ever looked at each other and decided, for whatever reason, to have a child. You can let a pie chart flatten that into 4 colored slices. Or you can do something harder and more interesting. Use the numbers as a doorway, then step through into history. Learn about the cultures that fed into you. Read their myths, hear their music, understand their wars, their famines, their migrations. And then remember that there will be people in the future who list you as one of their ancestral layers. Maybe they'll take a test someday and see British, Indian, Nigerian, Polish, Jamaican, something else we don't have a word for yet in their report. They won't know your whole story. They'll just see your contribution as one thin colored slice. The only place the full version exists is here, now, while you're alive, to ask, where did I really come from? And what kind of ancestor do I want to be for the people who come next? That's a question no DNA test can answer for you. But understanding the wild, layered, messy history behind a simple word like British might help you ask it a little more honestly.